Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday, the somewhat irregular series of modelling videos that I occasionally put up, as the title would suggest, on a Wednesday. This week we're cracking on with the stronkest of Stronk tenks, as voted for you lot at the end of the last video, the mighty KV-2. This is a 1/35th scale model, built by, well not built, but manufactured by a Russian company, Zvezda. I've never built any of their kits before. And I picked this up for a very reasonable, less than £30 price from my local model shop. Now, I have plans for this kit beyond just building the KV-2. I want to do a full-scale diorama, and I've got a bunch of other stuff to go with it. From mini art, Soviet road signs of World War II. I also have a bunch of anti-tank obstacles, also from mini art. I'm not sure if I'm going to be using these for what I have in mind, but, well, when you're building model tanks, it's useful to have a bunch of anti-tank obstacles. Soviet ammo boxes with shells, and down there in the bottom right corner, that's the holy hand grenade of Stalingrad, the 152mm high explosive and concrete busting shells. And then, filmed slightly later because they arrived separately, Soviet tank crew at rest. They also come with their own ammunition crates, but, well, wrong caliber for the KV-2. But it's nice to have. I'm sure I'll put them to use at some point later on. Also, we have a bunch of Soviet infantry at rest, so they're going to be sitting by the side of the road where the KV-2's parked up and the crew are just relaxing. And then finally, we have a bunch of German captives being escorted to the rear by a Russian soldier. All of these kits, except for this one, which is by Masterbox, all of the other kits are from Mini Art. And then, of course, I also have to build the diorama that they're all going to be placed on, so quite an ambitious project ahead of me. That should keep me busy for a good few weeks. So let's get that box opened and see what lies ahead of us. My one big fear is that I'm going to have to make the tracks by hand. I mean, obviously I'm going to have to make the tracks by hand, but I mean that I'm going to have to make each individual link and track pin by hand, because holy shit, that is going to be tedious. And it's going to take forever. I got Rita an A39 Tortoise model kit by Meng, and that's what you have to do for the tracks on those. And I've seen what they look like when they're done on YouTube, and they do look amazing. They are the most realistic moving tracks that you are ever going to see on a model. But I'm not looking forward to doing them. Luckily, with this kit at least, it's kind of a good news, bad news situation. It's not great in that it's not like on the M3 Lee that we did, where they're just a set of rubber tracks that you basically just have to paint and connect up. Here, it sort of meets you halfway. There is some individual track assembly that you have to do, but the majority of the tracks are in a single connected piece, so that is a huge relief. The section of track that goes along the bottom under the road wheels is one piece. The section of track that goes over the top along the return rollers is one piece, but you only really have to make the individual track parts around the drive sprocket and I've forgotten what it's called, but it's the big wheel at the other end of the tank that isn't the drive sprocket. You know what I mean. I'm sure I'll remember what it is half an hour from now and just blurt it out. So that's good. I'm also not seeing a huge amount of internal parts. I'm seeing some, which is kind of weird. I mean, this isn't a full internal build kit. But it's just a little strange, some of the things that they have chosen to represent on the interior of the tank, even though you're never going to see them unless you stick an endoscope through an open hatch, and the things that they haven't. I mean, the gun, the 152mm howitzer, is a full build. And that's fine, because it's the KV-2. The gun is the secret to the KV-2's magic. I want to build the gun. But there are other things that just don't really make a lot of sense. I mean, the machine guns, for example. There's one at the front of the hull, and there's one in the rear of the turret, and all you're ever going to see of them are the barrels. And yet, the machine guns themselves, you have to build, and they come in multiple parts. What's the point? The periscopes as well. You can obviously see the periscope housings sticking out of the top of the turret. and if you were to stick an endoscope with a light on it through the open hatch at the top of the turret, assuming you left the hatch open, you would see that the periscopes are fully modelled inside as well. But nothing else in the turret is, other than the gun. So, yeah, some weird choices. But, what are you going to do? It is what it is. So, I guess we're going to get started. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to make you watch the entire build process, so this video would be about 9 hours long. So we're going to be watching some of the build, and I'll stop when it comes to anything particularly interesting or particularly annoying, and discuss it in greater detail. But for now, just sit back, relax, chill out, and watch me put a KV-2 together. Oh yes, the tracks. I knew these were going to be a problem. You see, the instructions just, well, lie to you. What you're supposed to do here is take a single piece of track link and glue it to this one continuous pre-assembled piece of track that sits under the road wheels. Then, at that kind of angle, you connect this 4-piece of pre-assembled connected track that leads up to the drive sprocket. The same thing at the other end, idler wheel, that's it, I've just remembered what it's called, yes. You do the same thing at the other end at the rear of the tank, so that you have a section of track curving up and connecting to the idler. Then you take 6 pieces of individual track link, and at each end you glue them together in a sort of semicircle so that they wrap around the drive sprocket at the front and the idler wheel at the back. Or is that the idler wheel at the front and the drive sprocket at the back? You know, I don't know. I don't know if the KV-2 was front or rear wheel drive. Probably rear wheel. Doesn't really matter. The point is that the instructions tell you to make that semicircular section of track out of 6 pieces of individual link. But 6 aren't enough. It just won't fit. So I had a bit of a panic moment when I realised this. Luckily, they do provide you with more than enough pieces of individual track links so that you can just add an extra, I think, 2 pieces in order to make the entire section of track actually fit and connect around the road wheels, around the idler wheel, across the return rollers, and then connect up again back around the drive sprocket. But after suffering a mild heart attack at realising that it didn't actually work as instructed, I did figure it out. And it was all good in the end. And then, of course, I had to do it all again on the other side of the tank. And it was at that point, when I had finally gotten everything put together and the tracks on, that I realised I'd put one of the road wheels on the wrong way round. But of course, I only noticed after everything had been glued into place, and with the tracks being as fragile as they are, I was in no rush to take it apart and do it properly, so fuck it. I'm just going to have to live with it. Anyway, that's the lower hull and the suspension and tracks done, both sides. Now, with that hopefully going to hold together, it is a little flimsy, the plastic isn't particularly thick, it's job done and time to move on to the upper hull. Bloody hell, Jingles, done already? Well, no. This is just a dry fit, I haven't glued anything into place, just to see how it's all going to fit together. And unfortunately, it doesn't really fit together that well. I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say it doesn't fit. I mean, it does, with a bit of effort, with a bit of bending and twisting, which is alarming because it's not particularly thick plastic. Normally when you have this kind of problem, the best thing to do is to just take the upper hull, for example, drop it in a pot of warm water to make it more flexible. But it's not the upper hull that's the problem, it's the lower hull, and that's all glued together, so shit. Nevertheless, with some extremely careful manipulation, I did manage to get it into the correct position long enough for the glue to set and fix it into place. Even then, there was another problem to do with the fit, in that some of it just doesn't. Even when you've put the reinforcement plate over the join at the front between the upper and lower glacis, there is still a gap. It just doesn't fit together properly. It's not just that there's a gap at the top, it's also not actually wide enough to fully fit. So I can probably fix this with some modelling putty. Applying the putty isn't going to be a problem. It's sanding it and filing it down so that it doesn't look like a massive blob of, well, putty. So that it actually looks like a rough weld, for example. Getting that done without applying so much pressure to the model that I pop the seams on all the bits that have been glued together, that's going to be tricky. With that taken care of, all I had to do was apply all of the remaining extraneous parts to the upper hull, and then I can make a start on the gun and the turret. And here she is, fully assembled. Although I'm sure the more eagle-eyed tank aficionados amongst you have probably by now noticed that there is something missing. Anyone figured it out yet? I'll give you a clue, it's at the front. Not the bit that we're looking at, I realise this doesn't help. Sorry. While you're trying to figure it out, the turret is removable, by the way. It hasn't been glued into place because I'm going to paint them in separate sub-assemblies, the hull and the turret. But the bit that's missing is right at the front of the tank on the upper glacis. Here, I'll point it out to you. For those of you who haven't guessed yet, there's supposed to be an applique armour plate over the front of the upper glacis at the top, where the machine gun ball mount and the driver's viewport is. And it's included in the kit, but it's not in the instructions. And I didn't notice until long after this point. In fact, it was while I was painting the hull that I thought, hang on a minute, there's a bit missing, because at no point during the instructions does it tell you to cut this bit off the sprue and attach it to the tank. And because I was following the instructions, I didn't do it. And when I realised, it was far too late. But at the end of the day, not every KV-2 had this extra piece of armour, so it's something else I can live with. Not quite done with the build, still have to attach the tow cables, and this is where I ran into another problem with the instructions. You see, according to the instructions, the tow cables are supposed to be threaded through the brackets that attach the mudguards to the hull. The problem is that the shackles on the end of the tow cables are too big to fit through the brackets. So what I had to do after assembling the tow cables and gluing them in place was tear the buggers apart, attach the shackles to the tensioner, which is attached to the side of the hull, and then try to feed the cable back through the brackets, and then because the cables had already been cut to the correct length, attempt to somehow persuade the bare millimetre of cable that poked through the bracket to once again connect up to the shackle on the other side of the bracket. This was all kinds of fun. And when I say all kinds of fun, I of course mean it in the sense of being a massive, colossal pain in the arse, and I only really managed to make it work on one side of the tank. As you'll see when I come to paint the hull, because I'm going to be doing something else that I have never done before. I'm going to be airbrushing. Now, it's my first time airbrushing anything, so I'm definitely not going to be trying to do anything too adventurous. I'm simply going to be priming it and then base coating it. And the primer that I'm using is Vallejo Model Air Hull Red, because that's exactly the colour of paint that would have been used to prime the real KV-2 in the first place. In case anybody's interested, because I know somebody will be, my airbrush is an Iwata HPCS. It wasn't particularly cheap. I mean, it wasn't ridiculously expensive. I think it cost about £140. I mean, you know, it was a substantial investment. But pretty much everybody you ask about airbrushes says, well, they don't say get an Iwata HPCS, but they do say don't waste your time getting a cheap airbrush, because you won't be happy. If you're going to get one, get a good one. And the Iwata HPCS is very definitely a good one. And it wasn't that expensive. Now, what was expensive was the air compressor. You can absolutely buy cheap air compressors. Just walk into any hardware store and they'll have a range of air compressors to suit your pocket, usually priced anything between £50 to maybe £120. The problem is how loud they're going to be. Let's just put it this way. These are the kind of air compressors that get used on building sites. If you try using them indoors, let's just say all of your neighbours, and I do mean all of your neighbours, are going to know when you're airbrushing something. And you are going to need to wear ear protection. Just to put this into context for you, the kind of air compressor that you would buy in a hardware store is probably going to be running at anything between 80 to 90 decibels. And that's hearing damage levels of noise. Even a hardware store air compressor that's specifically designed to be quiet is still going to be running at anything between 60 to 70 decibels. And that's vacuum cleaner levels of noise. Definitely not something that you, or your neighbours for that matter, are going to want you to be running indoors for extended periods of time, like for example, the length of time that it takes to airbrush a model. So I got myself an Iwata Studio Smart air compressor, which is about twice the price of the bloody airbrush, but it's really quiet. It runs at 40 decibels, and if you don't know what 40 decibels is, well, that's spoken conversation levels of volume. I can be airbrushing something and Rita's 2 rooms away and she doesn't even know that it's on. Alright, Jingles, but why do you need an airbrush in the first place? Well, I don't really need one, although, well, maybe I do. I want one because there's so much more you can do once you learn how to use an airbrush properly. And also, I mean, this was recorded at 10 o'clock at night, pitch black outside, and it had been raining for 3 days and was going to continue raining for another 2 days. So I couldn't spray, prime or undercoat my models outside. I had to do it indoors. But I had the airbrush, so I could. To give you an example of just how quiet this airbrush is, the noise that you can actually hear right now isn't the airbrush, it's the extractor fan from the spray painting booth. See if you can tell when the airbrush goes on. You hear the clicking noise. Obviously you can hear the hiss from the air being blown through the airbrush, but the clicking noise is the compressor. The extractor fan on the spray painting booth is actually the noisiest part of the whole arrangement, but even that's only around about 45 decibels. So yeah, this allows me to basically paint indoors, day or night, regardless of the weather. I mean, technically I could do that before anyway, with or without the airbrush or the spray painting booth, but I would have to do it by hand using a paintbrush, and that would take forever. So this is great. Now that the primer has dried, and it really doesn't take very long to dry at all when you're airbrushing, I'm applying a base coat of Vallejo Model Air Russian Green. This is a bit of a mistake. I mean, I didn't realise at the time. I thought, Russian green? Well, I'm painting a Russian tank in green. This is the colour to use. It kind of is and it kind of isn't. I mean, I like it. I do like the colour. But this is more of a late war colour. You've seen T-3485s, for example, painted in this colour. But the KV-1s and KV-2s tended to be painted in a much brighter shade of green because they were early war tanks. I mean, it's not out of the question to suggest that a KV-2 that had survived until, say, 1944 may have been painted in this colour. But it's such a dark shade of green, it's going to cause other problems for me. Particularly when it comes to weathering, because it's so dark, it's going to be really difficult to see any rust streaks that I choose to apply afterwards. What I probably should have done was put my man pants on and try out the hairspray chipping technique, because that would have worked perfectly for exposing the whole red underneath this dark Russian green top coat. Oh, hold on, back up a second there, Jingles. Hairspray chipping technique, what the hell's that? Well, the more experienced modelers amongst you probably know exactly what it is I'm talking about. But for the benefit of those who don't, hairspray chipping is an extremely fast and remarkably effective way of getting realistic looking weathering, particularly when it comes to exposing underlying layers of paint. What you do, or what I should have done, if I was going to use this technique, was once the whole red primer had dried, cover the whole thing in hairspray. Then apply the top coat of Russian green. Then take a paintbrush loaded with water and start brushing away at all the areas where you want the paint to chip off. Because the lacquer in the hairspray reacts with the water on the brush and it just starts flaking the paint off. Anything that's been painted over the top of the hairspray lacquer. So you just brush away with a wet brush or a toothpick and put some water on the model and chip away with that. But basically anywhere you touch it with water and agitate it with a brush or a toothpick, the top coat of paint is going to flake off. And it's incredibly fast and it's incredibly effective. But it was something else that I had never tried before, and I got kind of scared. But I think I'm definitely going to do it the next time I paint something. I think a model in this colour would definitely have benefited from it. Then again, I am still relatively new to this whole process, and I could probably benefit from a bit more of attacking a model with the old-fashioned paintbrush, rather than trying to rely on these newfangled, cheap and easy techniques like hairspray chipping. But at some point in the future, I'm definitely going to give it a go, just so I can see what it's like. Because at the end of the day, if I try it, like it, figure out what it's good for, what it's not good for, it's another tool in my toolkit. It's something else that I can use when it comes to making models in future. Doesn't mean I have to use it all the time, but if I can figure out how it works and learn how to do it properly, it's something else that I can use when it's appropriate to do so. In the meantime, I'm just applying a coat of matte varnish, and we're just about done with the KV-2. And yes, the blast of air from the airbrush, even though it's only running at 15 psi, did blow the tow cable right out of the shackle that it wasn't particularly well attached to. But again, that's something that I can fix later with a pair of tweezers and some glue and some patience. And at least one of those things is in very short supply around here. There are other little bits and pieces of tidying up that I want to do. I may also take the airbrush and get some black and just blacken up the gun barrel around the muzzle a little. But other than that, the KV-2 is pretty much done. Now I just have to do the ammo boxes, possibly also the tank obstacles, the crew, the relaxing infantry, the German prisoners being escorted to the rear, the Russian road signs, and the diorama that the whole thing is going to be set on. So I'm probably going to be busy with this thing for at least a month. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.